Greetings, friends. I always thought the Enlightenment was in the 18th century because that's when the French Revolution was. That's when the American Revolution was. But really, I think the Enlightenment, I guess it depends on what you call it, but it was really the 17th century because that's when you had Isaac Newton with his new physics and you had all the exploration of the globe because that was just being continued in the 18th century, but really it was the 1600s when all this was exploding into consciousness. I know it was started before that, but it really came into its own in the 17th century. That was that was when piracy was the big all the mythical and real pirates that we think of are from like the 17th century, like especially the 1680s and so you see, there's actually a revolutionary character to the political thought because it wasn't just science; it was philosophy and religion. A lot of this was carrying over from the Reformation. A lot of this stuff was what had become much more. The religious issues sort of went away in the 18th. Then they didn't go away, but like the that sort of Protestant force for religious war. You were no longer finding that in the French revolutionaries. It was much more secular. It was more pagan even what they wanted, but that's not the case in the 1600s. You've got all these competing sects. You got the splintering of the Protestant Reformation. You've got the Counter Reformation. This a lot of this started in the 16th century because Martin Luther was doing his thing, back in the early like 15. He started around 1518, around there, up to the 1520s, 1530s. That's when he's writing. That's when he's attacking the Catholic Church. But these things take a few generations to gather momentum, and you finally start to see these huge religious wars tearing Europe apart, especially Germany, which was lost so many people in the 30 Years' War that it was very comparable to what happened in like the First World War or the Second World War in Germany during that, because of mercenary armies and the sort of semi proto capitalist means of like engaging in never ending war, because whenever there's money there can be war, or war can make money. And so anyways, I'm getting a little distracted there, but in the 16th century that's when the political thought starts to really question monarchy, question kings. Now, I would say that obviously there can be bad monarchs, and monarchs get killed all the time in warfare, and they get, rebellious subjects maybe put them down. That's one thing. I'm not going to say that's a good thing or a bad thing, but it happens. Everyone knows it happens. But does that mean the society abolishes the rank of the king? No, not always. Hopefully, and probably not most of the time in history. They just replace that ruler's position with someone else. It's what you might call a coup, or maybe a different power comes in and invades, but they have a similar form of government with a king or some autocratic ruler, because that's just naturally what works out for making military decisions. You need one man to call the shots, one general, eventually. Now, that's not to say you can have the church influencing the monarch, and you can have a council for the monarch, and maybe something resembling even a parliament. But once you get into making a parliament, like they do in the 1600s, making a parliament almost sacred. They were not using that language, but the parliament represents the people. Who's the people? It's ambiguous, but that was the monarch's prerogative. He protects the people. Like Charles I, for all his faults, he did think of himself as the protector of the people, the English people. Just as Tsar Nicholas in Russia thought of himself as the protector of the Russian people. But now the parliament is starting to say, well, we can speak on behalf of the people, and then they ended up beheading Charles because they beat him in war, but ostensibly it was because he made war on his own people. That was the reason they gave. when they signed his death warrant for execution in 1649. And so obviously monarchs make mistakes, and there were financial problems with monarchies in France and England during the 17th century and into the 18th century. The monarchs looked for ways to stay financially afloat because the world was changing. It was becoming more mercantile. And then this is before the Industrial Revolution, but certainly the merchants, money is becoming more influential, and you get more of a rising middle class and cities, especially the rise of London. And and some say that the British financial empire is still around today, based in the specific. I don't mean the whole city of London, but there's that specific financial corporate entity, the City of London. This goes back centuries. But that entity, even challenging the king, like London was obviously on the side of Parliament during the English Civil Wars, which is the south and east of England, sort of against the north and west. That was, more, those areas were more for the king. Like obviously the south and the east, more commercial areas like London, they were for Parliament. But anyway, so you get this idea of challenging monarchies in really the 1600s, and then that happens in the English Civil War, which results in temporarily like a 10-year military rule in England, which is headed by Oliver Cromwell, the Lord Protector, who did not take the role of, or the formal role of being a monarch, but essentially he was in a similar role. And then they eventually restored the monarchy after he died, although it was watered down. From this point on in history, monarchies survived, but they had to now compete with parliaments. They had to compete with, I don't know if democracy is the right word, but some form of more like republican, government of lots more people. Because in the past, monarchs could just dismiss parliaments. They could just be, you guys are basically here to help me, raise money for me, or tell me what I need to be worried about. You can advise me on something, but it's my call what to do here, because I get that sacred divine right to rule from God. And what do you have? So there's a natural hierarchy there, but a lot of it's the tension with the nobility, and how's the nobility feel? And if they ever mix with the lower orders, then they'll overthrow the king. And then this is what happens again. That's what happened in the French Revolution, of course. The American Revolution, it's like, is it even a revolution? Because they say it's a conservative revolution. They weren't really trying to change much. They were just trying to preserve their English liberties, which I guess they would have gained from mostly the 17th century. I think, if not from the civil wars of the 1640s, I don't know much about the Glorious Revolution later in the 17th century, but I think sort of I'll be getting to it later in the book that I'm reading, but I think that's sort of what the American revolutionaries, as so-called revolutionaries, wanted to uphold. So some would say, well, then that's not revolutionary. But the question is, from the perspective of what's going on in the 17th century, and I don't know, because I've been reading this book about, the monarchy transformed in Britain in 1603 to 1714, and so I haven't gotten to the Glorious Revolution yet, but obviously from what I've been talking about, this is something that is revolutionary. It's upturning the old order, freedom from taxation, and all those nice things which sound nice, but which are based on individual liberties and abstract values, which can work well, but they have these inbuilt flaws which over time are going to get you into trouble, because eventually you're going to see that, we're going to need a king to take care of things. It could be a bad king or a good king, but so what am I getting at is that, the American Revolution was conservative. It was conservatively conserving the revolutionary values of the 17th century. Now that's a statement that I can tweak. That's not ultimate, take it with a grain of salt. But that's a working viewpoint for me. It's like, yeah, I was conservative in some ways, but yeah, just it was a continuation of a lot of the revolution, which really the ball got going the century earlier. With the case of France, I mean, it results in Napoleon. That there's a chaotic revolutionary period, and then it's Napoleon, who's also a general. Even after Napoleon, they bring back eventually a type of monarchy, but again, it's watered down. And then you fast forward a bit to end of World War I, when Tsar Nicholas of Russia and his family are murdered in a basement by the Bolsheviks and their bodies tossed down a mine shaft. Now, in each of these three examples, the monarch was executed, and his position was made known that this will never happen again. We're done with kings. But in each of those three situations, you got an autocratic, authoritarian type leader arising fairly quickly, like the Tsar's position being replaced by Lenin, and soon after Lenin, Stalin, who's a hard-fisted ruler. Of course, the system was different, and it's not the same as a monarchy, but there is that principle of one man coming to power. Now, that doesn't always happen in history, but it happens a lot. A lot of the time you get an oligarchy or mob rule. You don't get mob rule for very long, but you might get something that's like an oligarchy, kind of in the US right now. That's kind of an oligarchy, like the financial corporate powers, they're kind of behind the scenes. And is it just one of them that's really calling shots? Probably not. But there are probably a small number of people who are really influential, but not really one specifically. Maybe because they turn these countries into just markets, then your own power doesn't have to be located in the U.S. or somewhere or any other country. You could repeat this model in different countries, if you know what I mean. So, but with the American Revolution, they didn't bring in a king. They could have. George Washington was a very strong unifying figure, but they went for the Republican model, like France, I guess, sort of. But of course, I mean, that's gonna lead to an oligarchic form eventually, over time, because these things are gonna, if you build on certain foundations, then you can't be surprised when something sinks a little bit into that foundation. There's a certain logic that if you don't have a sacred, like monarchy, there's a sacredness to the monarch and the office he represents, serving God. And yes, he has a duty to the people. And there could be bad monarchs all the time, of course. Monarchs get killed all the time. They would get killed in battle and all that. But no one would think, okay, now there's no more monarchs. That's a difference between a rebellion or a revolt or an agitation for change on one hand, and an actual revolution on another. So I think I've yacked on long enough. Hasta luego, amigos.